And now to the presenters, Liza Davis and Susan Shea. They will speak on the important theme of how Montessori and music can be instruments in the healing process of children with trauma. And we're sure there will be many, many questions on this, so please leave these in the chat. And at the end of the session, there will be a little time to field a selection. First, of course, the key word, trauma. And originally, I think it was just a word to denote external wounds. And now we always refer to it as wounds that have been internalized, emotional responses to major upsetting events. And the first speaker will be Liza. Liza currently serves as the Interim Executive Director and Co-Director of Pedagogy and 3 to 6 training at the Montessori Center of Minnesota. She holds a Master of Arts with an emphasis on trauma and resilience from Concordia University, alongside, well, that's not to be expected, a 3 to 6 diploma. She'll be sharing essential insights, and it's over to you, Liza. We're very keen to listen to you and hear you.
Thank you, Yoka. As we get started today, I think it's really important we start with acknowledging that when we talk about trauma, we're talking about our humanness in a way that can be very powerfully hard. And so as I start today, I'm going to talk about research. I'm going to talk about how trauma impacts children and development and all of us and its prevalence. And so if we acknowledge that, I also am going to encourage you to do what you need to do to protect yourself. Trauma is living and breathing in our communities, and that means it's living and breathing in us. And so if you need to take space, if you need to pause and reconnect with self, please do so. I want to start with just sharing that why I became interested in this subject. And I was working as a mentor and teacher trainer and was working with practitioners who were seeing more and more children coming in with high needs, sometimes explosive behaviors are becoming, or children who are withdrawn. And this became increasingly heightened with the pandemic. And this led me to really pursue my master's so I could learn more about trauma and its impacts, and then bring back that learning to training and in service of those who are in service. And while I anticipated learning lots of new techniques to bring back to training or my work as a mentor, what was more compelling was discovering that the very principles of Montessori education naturally align with trauma-informed practice. And this was really a revelation. And so as we get started today, I want to kind of take you on a journey that's similar to what I went on in my master's. And I will center it around this component of trauma-sensitive practice, which is used interchangeably with trauma-informed practice. Trauma-informed practice was developed by medical professionals in service of responding to specific traumas, and it kind of requires knowing what has happened with the individual. Trauma-sensitive practices, on the other hand, are considered good for everyone. So we don't need to know specifics. We can just assume that this serves humanity and it serves children specifically, as we talk more today. And so it's composed of this sort of 4 components: realizing the widespread impact of trauma, recognizing how trauma manifests and what the signs or symptoms are of the impact of trauma, and understanding potential ways to recover or heal, which includes building resilience. And this also then requires us to respond by adapting our approach and creating prepared environments that consider trauma to serve healing from it. And again, healing means a return to wholeness. Additionally, we have to resist re-traumatization. So this means moving forward with care and intention. It is exceptionally important for us to start with understanding what trauma is and what it isn't. Trauma is an overused word. And this is imperative that we talk about what trauma is, because when we don't acknowledge it, or we think about it as something that only exists in certain places or impacts certain communities or people, we don't address it. We ignore it. And as leading trauma psychologist Peter Levine says, trauma is perhaps the most avoided, ignored, belittled, denied, misunderstood, and untreated cause of human suffering. But here is the truth. Trauma and toxic stress impact most of us, which is why it is often listed as one of the public health crises of our time. Research shows that over 2/3 of people will experience a traumatic event in their lifetime. This is according to the World Health Organization. And in a recent survey by the American Psychological Association, nearly 2/3 of respondents said their lives were permanently changed by the pandemic. The report also showed that a large portion of the country has been living in sustained survival mode, with significant consequences for mental health. The World Health Organization also says that the pandemic sparked a 25% increase in anxiety and depression worldwide. And statistics indicate that children are recovering less quickly than adults. Trauma not only affects individuals, it affects communities, families, and entire generations, contributing to a high rise in mental health disorders in the last 20 years. And again, this is a worldwide affliction. In some ways, today's culture has become toxic. And I would encourage you to read Gabor Mate's book on the myth of normal if you want to investigate that more. For example, chronic stress about things like climate change have led to greater depressive symptoms and hopelessness in ways that have incremental and long-lasting negative implications on the mental health of children and young people. So what is trauma? While impact is everywhere, you might be asking yourself, what are we really talking about here? So let's define it. Trauma comes from the Greek word meaning wound and is a complex term with a broad spectrum of definitions. Historically, it was used to describe the psychological and emotional scars left on soldiers returning from war. However, as our understanding has evolved, trauma is now seen as a far more pervasive phenomenon. And this definition here is from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, noting that trauma is an event, series of events, or set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and that has lasting effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. This definition highlights several key aspects of trauma. One, trauma is not the event itself, but rather how an individual experiences and processes it. The same event can be traumatic for one person and not for another. The impact of trauma is deeply personal and is influenced by factors such as the individual's past experiences, personality, and available support systems. Second, trauma can come from a single event or from chronic exposure to stressful conditions. The distinction between acute and chronic trauma is critical. Acute trauma stems from a specific, often life-threatening event, such as an accident, a natural disaster, or acts of violence. We call this big T trauma often. Chronic trauma, on the other hand, results from prolonged exposure to adversity, such as ongoing neglect, abuse, or living in an unstable environment. And this is sometimes referred to as little T trauma. But little T trauma can become big T trauma when it happens over and over again. Dr. Gabor Mate, a leading expert in the field of trauma, offers a profound perspective on how trauma operates in our lives. Mate asserts that trauma is not merely about what happens to us, but how we are able or unable to process what has happened. It's what happens inside you as a result of your experiences. Trauma, he explains, often arises when an individual is left alone to cope with overwhelming emotions. In addition, trauma also includes adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, which were revealed in a groundbreaking 1998 study that examined the long-term effects of abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction on over 17,000 adults. Researchers discovered that the more ACEs a person experienced, the greater the risk for a wide range of negative outcomes in adulthood, including chronic disease, mental illness, substance abuse, and even early death. One of the most important takeaways from the ACEs study is that the common nature of toxic stress and the impact of trauma is cumulative. The initial study and ongoing studies have demonstrated that the more adversity an individual is exposed to in childhood, the greater the likelihood of long-term negative effects on their physical, cognitive, spiritual, and mental health. And this is particularly concerning because many children in today's world are exposed to multiple ACEs, increasing their vulnerability to trauma's harmful effects. Since the original ACE study, additional research has expanded the definition to include adverse community environments. Historical trauma, racism and discrimination, poor housing quality, affordability, economic oppression, community violence, being unhoused, and being an asylum seeker. And it's really important to acknowledge that systemic oppression is a component of community adverse experiences. To address all of the trauma in the world, we also need to recognize how trauma and toxic stress can impact behavior, development, and learning. Trauma profoundly affects the brain and body, influencing mood, behavior, and overall development. In childhood, the impact of trauma is particularly pronounced due to the rapid developmental processes occurring in the brain. Understanding the lasting consequences of trauma requires examining how it reshapes brain structures, influences behavior, and hinders learning, social development, and self-concept. Trauma has the potential to induce lasting changes in the brain through epigenetic modifications. These changes, which alter how genes are expressed, can influence a person's mood, overall health, responses to stress, and susceptibility to physical and mental health conditions. Chronic stress, often caused by traumatic experiences, can reshape brain architecture. And we know that in Montessori. Our environmental experiences shape our very personality, but also our brains. The amygdala, responsible for processing emotions such as fear, and the hippocampus, essential for memory formation, are two areas that can be deeply affected by trauma. In a stressful or unsafe environment, the brain's hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis becomes overactive. It's that fight, flight, freeze, fawn, and this can lead to a prolonged stress response. This persistent activation can impair the development of higher level cognitive functions, making it difficult for children to move beyond survival mode that they may be caught in due to adapting to their environmental experiences. Consequently, they may struggle with attention, emotional regulation, and impulse control. And these are some of the things you may see. Trauma is often, it's important to note, not recognized in children because its symptoms such as inattention, hyperactivity, and withdrawal are misinterpreted as behavior problems rather than signs of adaptations to their environment due to adverse or traumatic experiences like abuse, neglect, or a general lack of safety. As Mate and others like Dr. Bruce Perry recognize, healing from trauma requires reconnection to oneself, to others, and to the environment. And this idea of reconnection is key in understanding how Montessori environments are uniquely suited to support trauma recovery, as we'll explore a little bit more. When children experience toxic stress, it affects their capacity for self-regulation and emotional processing, which is necessary for learning. Children exposed to trauma may present exaggerated responses to perceived threats, avoidance behaviors, or difficulty forming relationships. Additionally, developmental and academic delays may happen as hyperarousal can make it challenging for children to focus or learn, as their brains are preoccupied with ensuring safety rather than processing new information. Here are some more examples of how trauma may present in symptoms and behavior that you may see. Trauma can hinder the development of the prefrontal cortex, which plays a crucial role in executive function skills like focus, impulse control, and planning. I think it's important to note this component of trauma can present similar to ADHD. As a result, children exposed to chronic stress may struggle to follow simple directions, manage their emotions, or stay on task. Now, while it's important to note that trauma impacts development, Resilience and protective factors can help mitigate the impact. Each of us has a component of resilience, and consistent caring interactions with supportive adults can help children build resilience and recover or cope with the negative impacts of trauma. Resilience is not a fixed trait. It is like the fulcrum in the middle here. It's a dynamic process through which we adapt to challenging experiences due to mental, emotional, or behavior capacities. And just as there are adverse childhood experiences, we need to acknowledge that there are positive childhood experiences that support resilience building, most of which focus on developing a strong sense of relationship. And this can include participating in community and cultural traditions, feeling encouraged to talk about your feelings with families and friends. And again, one strong relationship with one adult is proven to support resilience in children. In addition to recognizing resilience, it's important to recognize personality. We don't all process things the same way. Again, how we experience trauma is individual. So we need to acknowledge that some children and some of us are more sensitive to our environment than others. And to look more into this, I would encourage you reading and looking into the work of Thomas Boyce, who talks about the orchid and the dandelion as seen here. Some children are just less sensitive, and they can develop and they have more resilience built into them in different ways. And some children are going to be more sensitive. They've added the tulip to this new research, so I would encourage you to look more into that. So if we can acknowledge that trauma is prevalent and it's living and breathing in our communities and recognize that it is hindering development, we then also need to understand how we can support from the periphery. What we don't need to do is go into our environments looking for or trauma or delivering the ACE questionnaire to our children or examining what specific experiences that child might have. We need to figure out ways to make a difference and provide conditions suited to the unfolding of life that Dr. Montessori talks about. This is where we can take a cue from Dr. Montessori. She reached out and she also tuned to the children and looked at what she could do to improve their conditions, and we can do the same. Dr. Montessori viewed the child as a whole in scope of their present and their future, including our collective future as humanity, and this drove her advocacy. When we advocate and serve the child, we serve humanity in the global mission Dr. Montessori championed. She stated, we need to encourage the science of education that helps people to defend their human freedom. So therefore, our science contemporarily requires that we acknowledge trauma, recognize how it can negatively impact development, and also look at how we can counter the impact. As Dr. Burke-Harris notes in her book, The Deepest Well, we need to intervene by serving the development of children well, so their trauma doesn't become written into the biology of the rest of their lives. While trauma exists and may impact children in all of the ways I just talked, and there's quite a bit more, but we have 30 minutes, so we can also respond by creating prepared environments. And a key component to this in Montessori and trauma-sensitive practices is to observe. And I think what you'll experience as I start talking about trauma-sensitive practices is what I experienced when I went through my master's, is this revelation again of this alignment of what is considered trauma-sensitive practices and what we do within the Montessori environment when we apply our pedagogy to and create our Montessori practices. So observe and respond while recognizing what we're seeing as an outward manifestation of the child's inner life. As I continue today, I'm going to focus on Bruce Perry's 6 R's to support children in healing from trauma. This is Dr. Bruce Perry, and these are the 6 R's. As I talk through these, I'm also going to note where the practices may fall within Montessori principles and pedagogy. The first of Dr. Bruce Perry's 6 R's is relational. Relational in service of safety. Because children who have experienced trauma often live in environments that are unpredictable or chaotic, A key aspect of creating a trauma sensitive environment is that it prioritizes individual safety for each child. Often children who have been exposed to trauma have developed in conditions that are unpredictable, causing them to disconnect from the environment, themselves, and others as part of that process. Emphasizing routine and predictability provides a safe and stable environment for children to reconnect. Daily routines need to be consistent. Transition should be handled with care. Thinking of Montessori principles, we work to create a physical and psychological space in service of children. And in doing so, can establish a holistic, prepared environment that promotes a sense of security. One mechanism for doing so is our attention to detail and creating a sense of order in the physical and, again, the psychological environment. One mechanism, again, is everything has its place. The materials are carefully arranged and visually appealing so that children can access them. This allows children to know what to expect. When we have consistent routines, predictability helps reduce anxiety. For children who are used to often living in chaos, predictable, prepared environments can be a refuge where they can relax and focus, but it requires us to create those routines. Again, the relationships that need enhancing are not just to the environment, but also to self and others. Research consistently shows that a supportive relationship with a caring adult is one of the most powerful protective factors. It is necessary, then, that adults continue to observe, focus on building relationship, and respond to children with undying faith in the child and consistency in approach, which is rooted in love. And Dr. Montessori gave an example in her time of this kind of love being offered to a child who'd experienced trauma in 1908 after the Messina earthquake. A child who'd lost both of his parents, Bruno, was a boy who was very withdrawn in the beginning. And the adults would stop by and continue to offer care. They would hold his hand and get down and tell them that they loved him. And as a result, over time, he returned that affection, slowly and over time. Additionally, not only is it relationship with others, but it's relationship with self, building confidence in who they are. One help to this is making sure that the environments are clearly rooted in cultural and spiritual practices that help the child feel connected to the larger community. I hope this sounds familiar to Montessorians. This is where we can root ourselves in our Montessori principles, because this helps create capacities to cope with toxic stress. Additionally, experiences need to be relevant, developmentally matched to the child, and not based on grade or age level standards. Individual activity provides an opportunity to children to engage with their self and reconnect with their self, to process their emotions. And this is a key trauma-informed approach and should, again, sound familiar. Another key component of trauma-informed care is the use of repetitive, rhythmic activities to help children regulate their emotions. Dr. Bruce Perry's research on the neurobiological effects of trauma highlights the importance of rhythmic, repetitive tasks in calming the nervous system. These activities help children move out of a state of hyperarousal and into a more regulated state. Sound Montessori? Practical life exercises such as sweeping, polishing, pouring involve repetitive motions that help children develop focus and serve self-regulation while integrating mind and body toward a unified goal. Often in trauma-sensitive practices, there's a lot of focus on mindfulness and bringing in yoga and mindfulness practices. But if we think also about activity and work of the hands, that is a component of mindfulness practice. And I want to tell a little story about a child that I've observed and worked with who was quite dysregulated due to his experiences and was quite withdrawn in some ways and quite explosive in others. And it was through this process of connecting with practical life. It started with polishing, and it became something where he started working through all of the different environments in the building to find anything wood and large wood, not little tiny objects, but polishing a desk, polishing this large giraffe we have in the practice environment here at the Montessori Center in Minnesota. And that helped him reconnect with self. And as he reconnected with self, he became less withdrawn. He started talking more to others and connecting more to others. And so this is a slow process, but it can happen through this purposeful work. Similarly, sensorial activities such as matching, grading, and sorting materials engage the child's senses in a way that promotes calm and concentration. These activities are not only enjoyable for children, but also serve as a form of therapy. The repetitive motions help children regulate their nervous systems, while the concentration required for the task helps them develop a sense of mastery and competence. For children who've experienced trauma, the sense of control over their environment can be incredibly healing. And I want to note that it's not just children. We've had experiences here at in my work with adult learners, where the adults in working with the sensorial materials and practical life have found this reconnection to themselves, and they've talked about it quite powerfully, often in an emotional state of healing and being present in themselves in a way that they hadn't been allowed to be, or were healing from their own childhood traumas. So again, it's not only with the children, this is also something that's powerfully important for us as adults. Historically, in her work with the French and Belgian children during World War I and following World War I, Mary Crummell noted that working with the sensorial materials provided, quote, a veritable cure for all the children's symptoms of trauma. When matching, grading, and sorting, the children compare, contrast, and categorize and practice, again, what Dr. Bruce Perry refers to as patterned repetitive neural input to the brainstem, which helps healing. It's also key that experiences are rewarding. Trauma often strips individuals of their agency. Children who've been abused, neglected, or otherwise traumatized may feel powerless and out of control, and autonomy is particularly important for children who've experienced trauma, as it allows them to regain a sense of control over their lives. Montessori pedagogy encourages independence and self-direction, helps children rebuild their sense of autonomy, and when children are allowed to make choices about their work and are given tools they need to succeed, they begin to develop confidence in their abilities. Again, by offering children the opportunity to build independence through repetition and self-mastery, Montessori provides a healing environment that encourages empowerment and choice. And I know Susan's going to talk more about this, but movement, music, dance, these are key to healing from trauma as well, as it is through activity that mental and physical energies are being united. And I just wanted to provide some historical looks at what this can look like within the Montessori environment. Mindfulness practices, again, are often what's discussed with rhythmic, but it can also be thinking about things differently, focusing on this unification of the mind and body. It may also be things like walking on the line or running or dancing together. Also, we also need to root ourselves in being respectful of the child, the family, and the culture. It's rooted in respect for human beings and intentionally listening for and understanding what the child is going through and how we can serve and support, while checking our biases, expectations, and developing the prepared adult to serve that individual child. Now, much of this is rooted in Dr. Montessori's work. The alignment between trauma-informed practices and Montessori education is profound. And in many ways, it's not surprising. Many of the children she worked with had experienced high levels of adversity and what we now recognize as toxic stress. These early experiences shaped Montessori's understanding of the vital connection between a child's environment and their emotional, cognitive, spiritual, and social development. Two resources I would really encourage you to look at if you're interested in learning more about this specific component of Dr. Montessori's work in alignment with trauma-sensitive practices are these two here. And I want to specifically talk about this organization called the White Cross. During World War I, Montessori became increasingly concerned about the psychological impact the war had on children. Many had been orphaned, displaced, or witnessed violence and destruction, leaving them emotionally and psychologically scarred. And this quote here really speaks to that. Montessori recognized that these children needed more than just physical care, they needed psychological healing. And in response, she advocated for the creation of the White Cross, an organization focused on helping children recover from the trauma of war. While the Red Cross provided medical aid, Montessori's White Cross would offer psychological care to heal the mental wounds of the children. The mental wounds, she talks about here. Dr. Montessori saw these traumatic experiences like war, the way the traumatic experiences like war had on young children. And the White Cross wasn't intended to train teachers and nurses in Montessori's methods, with a focus on helping children recover emotionally and psychologically. Now, what we know is overall, while the White Cross never came to fruition, the legacy of Montessori is very much tied to these trauma-informed practice. The Montessori approach has always been rooted in the practice of supporting healing and a unification of the mind and body. As Dr. Montessori notes here, the principles of the Montessori approach, including spontaneous, interest-driven work and engagement of the mind and body and spirit, proved to be effective in helping children heal themselves. And through engagement in the prepared environment, children who had been emotionally withdrawn or behaviorally dysregulated began to calm, regulate their emotions, and engage intellectually and socially in healthy ways. In many ways, Montessori's concept of normalization is deeply connected to trauma-sensitive practices. Normalization refers to the process by which children achieve a state of inner calm, focus, and self-discipline through engagement in meaningful work that supports that unification of the mind and the personality. And in thinking of rebuilding and reunification, if we see that as part of our work in helping children heal in response to the toxic and chronic nature of stress in today's world, we also have to be committed to understanding that it's on the child's timeline and requires, again, our patience, faith, and service, which Dr. Montessori reminded us of. It depends on the child, sometimes a week, sometimes a month, sometimes even a year. But the Montessori environment can support healing, and this idea remains central to trauma-informed education. By creating environments where children can engage in meaningful work and develop their full potential, environments can provide conditions for children to heal from the emotional and psychological wounds of trauma. As we become more aware of the pervasive impact of trauma, there is a great need to create physical and psychological environments that support both learning and emotional recovery. And unlike I thought initially when entering my master's, it doesn't mean abandoning what we do in Montessori, but perhaps centering our principles in different ways. There is great hope in this work, serving children and our humanity, even in the face of adversity and toxic stress.
Well, Liza, thank you so much. This was very insightful and very all-encompassing as well, I think. I'm sure that there will be questions, but we expect them in the chat, and we will answer them at the end of the at today's AMI talk. And now it's over to Ren.
Yes, hello everyone. So our next speaker is Susan Shea. Susan has practiced as a Montessori 3 to 6 guide for over 30 years in both North America and Europe. She has been making music since her early childhood in Dublin, Ireland, and she is a music coach for children and adults from the refugee community. We will be sharing some links related to some resources that are relevant to Susan's presentation. We'll be sharing them in the chat. If you don't happen to catch them, you can email us and we'll be happy to share them with you. Before Susan's presentation, Susan wanted to share a small music clip with you all. It's called Hello to All the Children of the World.
Thank you so much for being my sound engineer. It's very lovely. Thank you, Erin. Hello, everybody. I would also like to add to that short story about my life in Montessori that I arrived here in Vienna approximately 10 years ago, and it was during the same summer as many thousands of people entered this city from countries such as Syria, Lebanon, and Afghanistan. And of course, at that time, I combined my work in a school with working voluntarily with a very lovely outreach program called Let's Play Vienna, during which time we visited many residences where children and their families were accommodated. And prior to that, I worked in a very lovely public Montessori program in Hartford, Connecticut, which unfortunately in the year 2012 was very close geographically to where a very sad incident occurred, and 20 children aged 6 and 7 lost their lives in a very traumatic incident. And so it was not in the school in which I taught, but it felt as if we were neighbors because it was a couple of towns away. So working backwards, many of the schools in which I have worked were very safe, nurturing places in idyllic, rural, scenic places of the US. And I'd like to just think about for a moment the fact that Liza did remind us that no matter if we're coming from a country that is at war or a town that has had a very major traumatic incident, or if we are living in the most beautiful little corner of the world that never seems on the surface to have any problems, every child is potentially at risk to be affected by trauma of some sort. And so in listening to that little clip today, which is from my current place where I spend my lovely mornings, we don't know. When we sit among a group of children, we do not know what they have brought to school with them in their heart. We know that some of them come in schools in which we work without mittens when it's snowing and rain pants when it's raining, but we do not know what they bring with them otherwise. Trauma can affect the memory and the processing skills of young children due to emotional numbing, perhaps re-experiencing the traumatic event, perhaps survivor guilt, and even feelings of responsibility. This can affect perhaps a family in which parents are not getting along, and a child may have to witness a scene that they would really not want to before they even come into our classrooms. So the thought that I'd like to present as an opening thought is music has the potential to respond to trauma on a number of levels, especially because children are active, experiential learners, and music is one of the most profound human experiences. Now, the trick for us all is, how do we know what music is going to work better in this kind of a situation? And I did bring some instruments here with me today. I won't treat you to too much of this, but I did think about many years ago, I worked from a very lovely songbook that is used in many Montessori schools and other programs. And there was a beautiful song that the children found very soothing. It started like this. This is my school, my place to work and play. My friends and I are living out each day. Washing a table, polishing a cup. Every day I'm growing up. This is my school, my place to work and play. It's a very calming song, and it gives children a sense of place and a feeling of relaxation. But from the same songbook, I used to sing this a lot. I celebrate my family, people close to me. There are many branches in my family tree. Loving, caring, loving, caring. Now I think about this and I think, I didn't know or think about it at the time, but I sat in groups of children, and if I am honest with myself, I wasn't fully sure that that was their experience. Perhaps a child who is not leaving the house every morning from a loving and caring family situation, or perhaps in the child's perception, it's not. Perhaps parents too, adults, are coping with their own kind of trauma. And so we don't know how a child is perceiving their home environment before they come to school. It's worth thinking about before we select songs that we're going to sing. I am going to focus a little on singing at this point, because singing and spoken language, the experts are still unsure as to which evolved first. We're not sure whether humans communicated to each other using sounds that would be considered more musical than spoken word, or vice versa. And I like to remind myself of that point when I approach any group. In that children, when they are learning the language curriculum, as it is in a Montessori classroom, we are trained to expose them to activities that allow them to first express themselves. So we give them the tools through the sandpaper letters and into the movable alphabet to express their own thoughts before we ask them to start decoding the thoughts of somebody else. This is why people say, oh, those schools where writing happens before reading. And yes, that's part of what we're doing in a Montessori environment. As it applies to music, I always like to encourage children to feel like they can express themselves. That it should be the foremost intention inside in them, just as perhaps humans were prompted to communicate with each other using musical or spoken tones before they really settled down to analyze what somebody was saying to them. I'd like us to think as a group on two things during the next little while of this presentation. I'd like us to work collaboratively to brainstorm such that if you are comfortable singing in your classroom, or if you have music as a means through a CD or through some other way that you feel is very beneficial to the children you serve, I would encourage you to to jot that into the comments. I'd like us to create a collection of songs, suggestions of songs, pieces of music, pieces of classical music, ethnic music, choral music, noteworthy musicians, any sources that you feel have been beneficial to you. Because I feel that musicians as a whole, and also Montessori teachers, are born to collaborate. We are born to share. Our work is enhanced when we help each other, and we can certainly ponder each other's ideas and see if we can implement them in our own classroom. Our intent, rather than a curriculum, should be our starting point, because we do have a beautiful music curriculum in Montessori, but many schools lack some of the basic materials that other schools are very proud to have. And as I discovered from a very long time of working in several schools, some classrooms do have many materials, but the professionals are reticent. They're not confident about using them. And so sometimes these materials gather dust. And to all of the people thinking about, oh, that sounds like me, or I know someone in this situation, there is no need to be ashamed about that. But I'd like to take us all back to the beginning, to the core of all of this, because our intent, and not the materials that we have in our classroom or the materials that we feel we should have or we would like to buy, because some people actually contacted me during the week to ask me, well, I'm so looking forward to this because I want a list of what I should purchase for my learning environment. And I tend to go in the opposite direction. I feel we are all born with a voice. And, you know, I like to think that everybody's voice has a unique quality, just like the children and the adults who guide them. We have our unique personalities and our voices too. They do not have to meet a certain standard. I'm not a trained singer, as anybody who is will be first to notice, but I think that we need to feel good about ourselves in that we can lead, we can guide. We do not have to teach music if we do not feel qualified to. I'm qualified to do that and have done that in the past, but I don't take that on as part of my everyday strategy. And you don't have to feel that you should do that either. Let's talk about singing for a moment and what happens when humans sing. By the way, I'm loving the list of comments here that I see in the corner of the screen. Please keep these suggestions coming because we can create a very beautiful playlist for ourselves through that. So when humans sing, our bodies produce 3 hormones that promote relaxation. And those are endorphins, dopamine, and oxytocin. Now, I did have to go back and Google all of these to make sure I had a knowledgeable description of what these are. I know, for example, that oxytocin is described as the hormone of belonging and cohesion. Oxytocin is produced when a mother sings to her baby, for example. And actually, when we sing with the children, we produce that same feeling in them. Our voice doesn't have to be perfect or trained. Simultaneously, cortisol is reduced, and cortisol is a hormone related to stress. So humming or singing nudges our vagus nerve into action, and it sends signals of calm to our brain. It's like as if our nervous system receives a sign that we don't need to go into panic mode, especially if we're feeling a little anxious. If we came to school today and saw something that wasn't very pleasant at the breakfast table or on the tram or in the car. The vagus nerve is connected with the regulation of body functions, such as our digestion, our heart rate, and our immune system. And these functions are involuntary, so we can't consciously control them. But when we sing or when we hum, our vagus nerve sends those little signals of calm and actually soothes us. Now, I've had over the years many children who come into the classroom, maybe like dancing a little bit on one leg or humming to themselves. Some children in the past might sing a song like this: I'm going to dance class after, and then I have to go to Wegmans, and my mom has to get her hair cut. Sometimes children are processing stress and trying to reduce it in a way that's spontaneous to them, and that's singing. So I do it myself. I know that when the pandemic arrived, I probably drove my family members a little bit bonkers because I sang all the time, in the shower, out of the shower, cooking, baking, cleaning the house. I can never encourage a child to stop singing, because in our work cycle in the classroom, a child might be singing for the following reasons. It could be that a child is feeling challenged by the work that they are engaged with. It could be that the child is anticipating the onset of increased anxiety due to an expectation related to the product of their activity. That could be like, I've set myself this goal, I want to make the Roman arch. It's not working out. Okay, it could be, I'm going to complete 3 division problems with the stamp game because my teacher gave them to me and told me to please sit in the corner until they're done. Now, that's a topic for another discussion, but these things do happen in classrooms. And certainly, these are just 2 examples of a situation that can generate stress in a child. So finding a correct answer on a worksheet, maintaining perceived value in a group project, or keeping their clothes clean. Some children are sent to school with clothes that are rather impractical, and then it's a little bit stressful to try and not get paint on your nice dress. So if children are going to sing, it could be for some of those reasons. I'd also love that if you sing in stressful situations, I would love some anecdotes about that to be typed into the comments, because this is a really normal thing. And it's part of our human experience that is totally appropriate. And it's an inbuilt coping mechanism that we have, and that's very easy to use. The reasons that adults are hesitant to sing in the classroom are many. You could also type some of those, but I came up with some right off the top of my head. The first one that I've heard over the years is, well, I can't sing. The adult feels they can't sing. Now, I'm here to make you feel better about yourself if that is your opinion. on yourself, the child is not necessarily interested in the quality of the adults singing. One really logical reason is if you are working with children under the age of 6, they are process oriented. So that's great news for you if you're a little self-conscious about leading a group, because for children under the age of 6, it's more about gathering together, joining your multiple voices, and producing a common effect. The quality that can be worked on later. Another reason that I have thought about, adult feels they'll be judged by other adults on the musical material chosen, or they might be judged on the level of expertise demonstrated in a performance. It might be that an adult has a sense of inadequacy, and so in some cases that leads a classroom guide that the children maybe perceive as next in importance or closeness to their parent, but it might lead that person to outsource music to a whole other person. I'm going to hire a professional music teacher, a professional musician. They're going to come in once every week. It's going to be better. It's better quality. Now, that's not necessarily the worst thing you could do, but I suggest to you we need to be more forgiving of each other as members of a team who are focused on the needs of children. We don't need to be focused on the expectations of adults. Singing together should not be thought of as a performance, because to do so would actually be counterproductive. It's not unusual for children or even adults to become anxious at the prospect of a performance of any kind. And for a child who's experiencing trauma, this feeling can be even more intense. So let's think for a minute about some hypothetical pressures experienced by children during a performance. We'll say it's your once a year, twice a year event at your school. In some cases, the whole family attends, and that's not necessarily the best case scenario, because sometimes you have to drag a sibling who doesn't want to be there. Is there too much focus placed on cameras or recording devices? Do family members become distracted, engaging with other adults? In some cases, especially with a child who is experiencing trauma, the absence of a parent from an event like this is felt very acutely. And this can result in a child feeling different from other children, which of course is not what we're looking to achieve. If we're having a staged event or a performance, costumes, all of these extra things, they can invite conflict, emotional abuse, and unnecessary stress beyond the classroom. We can control what goes on within our classrooms to a degree, but we do not know what kind of interactions exist between children and their families beyond the classroom. I'd like to recommend to you, as a musician, that the content in some public performances is no longer meaningful to the children. And I went through, as Liza was speaking, I was trying to savor as much of this, and I tried to write notes where we could join our ideas. I did write how she quoted Bruce Perry as using the word relevant, because meaningfulness is part of our core as a Montessori environment, being relevant and being meaningful. What kinds of songs do we choose to sing with our children? either in private, in our classrooms, or in a public performance. They should be meaningful and relate to a child's everyday life. So another reason that an adult might not feel comfortable singing is they'd rather read a story. They'd rather focus on other topics. I'd like to encourage you, even if you're just not musically inclined, even 6 minutes of daily singing together is a natural bonding activity, even 6 minutes, 2 songs. What about if you're one of those adults who only knows 3 songs? A lot of people tell me this. Well, the good news is that in this worst case scenario, you can keep those tunes and you can simply put in some new words. For a child who is experiencing trauma, singing about things that are not real can be extra confusing, especially during the first plane of development. And so singing about reality is very grounding during the earliest years. I'm going to take this guitar out again for a second. Something that's very soothing to a child who maybe is not feeling their most confident is that they can hear themselves, their own name spoken in a group. And we have a very beautiful song. I'm not going to sing all of it because German is not my first language, but I do like this lilting tune a lot. In this current classroom in which I work, we have something that goes like this. Ali, hallo, wie schön, dass ihr da seid. Ali, hallo, wie schön, dass es euch gibt. Und die Susan ist da, und die Linda ist da, und die Sarah ist da, und die Marion ist da. Ali, hallo, wie schön, dass ihr da seid. Ali, hallo, wie schön, dass es euch gibt. Everybody gets to hear their name mentioned in the circle. If you have any song like that, please suggest it in the comments so that we can all look at this list later. Susan, 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 Susan all day long. Susan, 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 Susan. How do you like my Susan song? How about this one? Good morning, dear Susan, and how do you do? Good morning, dear Susan. It's nice to see you. This is the kind of song that, depending on how many children you have in your room, it could have 10 verses, 22 verses. It can go on, but every child's presence is valuable. And consequently, all of the verses are important. And for a child who is not living in their happiest moment, it actually could be the first time that day that they hear their own name spoken in a gentle and positive way. And that's something that is often overlooked. Some children live in homes where, due to stress or absent parents, perhaps the morning routine is very rushed, and perhaps they hear themselves spoken to. They might even hear their name being called, but it is not in a positive way. So that reinforces something that is very profound. It's nice to be spoken to in a nice way. What's going to happen if a child is not comfortable with hearing their name mentioned? Well, you can ask that child in the simplest way possible in a private place, away from the group. but more often than not, children will relish this. I would like to also make a point that my daughter reminded me of, and that is, in a singing circle, coercion does not belong. So it's just like when we give a lesson to the child, our albums always begin with invite the child to the show, invite the child to the circle, invite the child to sing. If they don't wish to, that is completely okay. Now, another aspect of processing music for young children is obviously making use of their natural tendency to move. And I did bring in a Montessori quote at this point. Through movement, we come in contact with external reality. And it's through these contacts we acquire abstract ideas. We are born to move. The Mayo Clinic says the effectiveness of using exercise to complement clinical approaches for alleviating trauma symptoms is well documented. And Liza has given us a comprehensive list of examples that also correspond to our various activities in a Montessori room. So let's think about dance and movement as a means of communication. Just like with spoken language, as we have learned from Dr. Montessori's observations of young children, we can assume that self-expression is a natural human impulse. And so don't be afraid if you don't have dancing skills. That's not the worst thing in the world. I'm going to invite you to experiment with improvisation, because the child, perhaps in the elementary years, is way more focused on a product, on doing something that they feel satisfied with. But a child in the first developmental plane is purely interested in the joy of experiencing a process. One simple game I'd like to draw your attention to is a common freeze game. And this has very few requirements for participation, other than the basic ideas of stopping and starting. I was reminded of the point Liza made when she said that children who have led a life that they feel they don't have a lot of control over, they do love and relish opportunities to exert control in very simple ways. Why not do this through a dance? Everybody dance. Everybody dance. Everybody dance. Everybody stop. It's so easy. I'm not a trained dancer either. We have to start at a very basic level at which children can appreciate and feel successful with. I love this game because it has a point of interest, just like a Montessori presentation. It has a phenomenon of alternating states, movement and stillness. That could be the point of interest. It has a direct aim, self-control, and an indirect aim, promoting trust through others. It has a control of error, but we don't want to point that out to children because the child will automatically want to imitate others. Now I have just a couple of minutes left and I'd like to leave you with some questions. How can I preserve the autonomy of every child in my group? Well, research has shown that groups who participate in singing or dancing ensembles gain a strengthened sense of community. And this is only true if all participants are willing. Please think about who are the people in my classroom community. Are they all feeling represented? What kinds of material am I using? Am I using cross-cultural material to reflect everybody's background or just my own? Do I work in an elementary classroom? Because children in an elementary classroom love role models. And I will you will find some of these links in the comments later. I picked two role models that I particularly love. They themselves suffered trauma as children. They are both gentlemen who now live in the United States. One is Iranian and the other is Syrian, and they are now well-known composers. And I hope at the end of this, you'll be able to look them up. As we approach the end of this part of the get-together, I'd like to leave you with one of Dr. Montessori's thoughts about music. Music can touch us in a way that nothing else can. No better gift can we give to the children than to open this door for them. And the good news is we don't need to buy things. We need to begin in a very simple way with intent. And we need to be there for the children as a positive energy source to help them use the gift of music. Thank you.
Do you want to think, Susan?
Yeah, thank you so much, Susan. That was really great.
Yeah, thanks very much. And we've seen, as you've already observed yourself, Susan, that there were lots and lots of was lots of sharing in the chat, people from with Spanish-speaking backgrounds, Chinese, English language backgrounds. They all commented on favorite songs, etc. So it goes to show that really music is the international language, I think. We have a few questions, I think, that came in. One of them takes us back right to the start of your presentation, Susan. What was the name of the songbook that we heard via the audio clip?
Yes, the name of that song is Hello to All the Children of the World. And I could probably investigate that as to where it came from. I first heard it in the classroom in which I currently work, but perhaps a quick trip on Google can come up with an actual source for that. I think it's great because it's very open, and of course in Vienna we have many transitory families who come in and out for all sorts of reasons, but I do feel that it's also a window into there are people beyond ourselves, even if they're not in our group, and we can learn even how to say hello to them. That's a nice beginning point, I think, for a song.
Yeah. And then I think a question that we could be fielded by Liza. And as Licha asked, that children in the Western world who do not sort of face war themselves at this stage, but they do see lots of distressing things on television or wherever. They're witnessing the traumatic situations. So, but they are worried about them. There has an impact on their development. So, what is your recommendation? What would be the best approach that we as Montessorians can follow in order to help and support them?
I think there's a couple of things. One is we want to try to limit exposure as much as possible and so trying to limit, and yet also acknowledging, just because we may think that they're not actually being impacted by that trauma, that because of the way children take things in, it can very much impact them as if they are experiencing it themselves. And so all of the things I talked about, including being prepared to help children process their emotions, is a really important component. So being available, talking about how they're feeling about it. And sometimes that means us kind of setting aside our feelings on it as adults and being fully present for the child in that moment. And then later also having another adult with whom we can talk to about our feelings. Now, when they're older, I'm talking about young children, first plane. When you're talking second plane, third plane, it can be much more of a conversation and a dialogue, but it is about developing opportunities to talk about their feelings and what they're experiencing in really intentional ways, and getting beyond sort of the basics of mad, glad, and sad, but into the details and the nuance of our experiences, and providing those opportunities.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we're going to take a couple more questions and then we'll probably round off. We have a music question, which goes like, would you recommend doing music anytime in a work cycle or on a fixed time every day? I think both of you could possibly answer that question, but let's start with Susan.
Well, I like, when Liza mentioned the repetitive nature, I think taking that on a large scale, that means it could be part of a routine. That would be very good. But I don't like to eliminate the possibility of spontaneous music making. I think that sometimes we become our most musical when we're under stress. And like I mentioned, sometimes maybe that is the reason that a child, however, if there's something happening in the classroom that could be disruptive with, it's perhaps taking and working outdoors could also be a possibility where people can sing and while they're hammering nails into little tree trunks or whatever, that could be workable. I think we need to be very flexible in how we organize ourselves because we adults can become very rigid in what we think is going to work, but we really have to put the needs of the children at the center of that.
Thank you. Would you like to add anything to that, Liza?
And I don't know that I have anything to add. I think it should be offered if it's part of our living humanity, and part of the developmental work is living humanity, then creating those opportunities and offering the opportunity and the freedom to pursue that kind of developmental work again should be offered at any point.
Thank you. And then one final question, I think. Chrissy, she says she's looking into bringing music to our YCC and CH classes, and she's looking for suggestions for trainings and resources. And she mentions Music Garden. I hope that Susan understands. Does it make sense to you? Because I don't understand the abbreviations myself. So I hope it makes sense to you.
We're talking about perhaps music for toddlers. And of course, toddlers are extremely musical people. So I'm a grandmother to one. I can fully attest to that. I'm not familiar with the program Music Garden, but I think as with a Montessori program, sometimes we are a diverse group of people that all have the same qualification. And sometimes visiting one room or another can present very different impressions of Montessori. So would encourage anyone who's looking into music programs for young children to please feel that it is entirely reasonable that you would ask to observe some classes at another premises before you bring somebody to yours. And I should plug my Phonetic Planet website while I think of it. I have some resources that pertain to music for young children on the Phonetic Planet website. That's www.phoneticplanet.org. So there would be also suggestions for toddlers and 3 to 6 and some small number for elementary. But most of these programs are very positive. I'm not against structured music instruction. It's just really important to assess the personnel before you make a choice. Having a qualification might not be the best match for your environment.
Okay, then we just have one question to round off from Alison, for Liza, that is. And she says, at the end of your presentation, you referred to your initial idea that we would have to abandon what we do in Montessori, but you learned otherwise. And if you could expand a little on that initial hesitancy that you had.
Yeah, I think part of it was talking to guides and mentors in my mentorship role and hearing that they felt like what they were doing wasn't working in service of the children. And so it was, sometimes when you go into these new trainings, you learn all of these new things that then when we apply them, they may change or alter or dilute um, the approach that we're trying to take with the child. And so that was sort of my initial thought was how do we stay true to the pedagogy and also take into consideration contemporary research. And yet contemporary research, as often is the case, supports a lot of what we already do and know. And it's just a matter of sort of centering that information in a different way. I also noted that Allison asked a question about serving the adults who do the work in service of the children, because often we are carrying that with us. And this is usually when I talk about this topic, I talk a lot about supporting educators in this work and the mental health supports that need to be in place to support those of us that are not in resilience. We often talk about filling our cup of resilience to support us in responding well to adversity. When you're a guide or a practitioner in service of others, you are a pitcher, you are not a cup. And so how do you continue to fill yourselves? And it's going to require collaborative supports and systems, large systemic supports and relationship supports. And there are some resources that I have around that. I highly recommend Elena Aguilar's work as a key support for that.